The smoke from the Vethran extraction ship still hung over the Cascades when Danner Holt drove home for the first time in 14 months. It was a particular kind of smoke, not the black gut punch of burning fuel, or the gray whisper of wood smoke, but something between yellow and rust, the byproduct of an atmosphere processor. The Vethrans had left burning on a ridgeline outside of Redmond before they withdrew. It smelled faintly of copper and ammonia, and something else that Danner couldn't name. Something organic that made the back of his throat itch in a way that no amount of swallowing could fix. He'd learned to stop trying. He drove with his left hand. The right arm ended just below the elbow in a pressure-bandaged stump that still ached in cold weather. And the weather in the foothills had been cold since October, which meant the ache had become something he wore like a second jacket. He was used to that, too. He drove a beat-up 2019 Silverado, manual transmission, that he'd relearned using a grip knob. His occupational therapist had bolted to the steering wheel, and he drove the way men drive when they're not actually thinking about the road. On instinct, on muscle memory, on the quiet automation that keeps you alive while the rest of your brain is somewhere else. The somewhere else for Danner was a ridge in the Wallawas. He drove and he was there, and he was here simultaneously, occupying both spaces with equal discomfort, and the mountains outside his windshield were the mountains outside his windshield, and also the ridge, the lip, they'd called it, jutting out from the primary terrain feature like a lower jaw, a slab of volcanic basalt, flat enough to run an observation post, narrow enough that any organized counterattack would funnel into a kill zone. That had been the theory. The theory had held for 9 days. On day 10, the Vethrans had stopped attacking from below. They'd come from above. No one in the human chain of command had anticipated that the Vethrans' secondary field units, the ones the NATO briefings called spinners, the ones the soldiers called something much less printable, could operate in the sustained absence of gravity by anchoring to terrain with their secondary limb clusters and pulling themselves across cliff faces the way a spider crosses a ceiling. The intelligence failure had cost 3 platoons. It had cost Danner his arm from mid-forearm down, a corporal named Wyatt Reyes, his left leg below the knee, a gunnery sergeant named Fern O'Keefe, both her hands to the second knuckle of every finger, and a 19-year-old private named Alejandro Vasquez, something that couldn't be measured in limbs or assigned coordinates on a body chart. Danner thought about all of this on the drive home. He thought about it the way you think about the thing you can't stop thinking about. Without, meaning to, without invitation. The way you wake up at 3 a.m. already mid-sentence in a conversation with a ghost. The exit ramp for his town appeared, and he took it without consciously deciding to, which was itself something. The body knows the way home, even when the mind is still 14 months gone. The house was smaller than he remembered, or he was larger. He wasn't sure which. He sat in the truck for 2 minutes in the driveway with the engine off and the keys in his lap, looking at the front door. The porch light was on, which meant his sister had been by. He appreciated that she didn't come herself. He'd asked her not to, and she had listened, and the lit porch light was her way of saying, "I was here. I thought about you. I respected what you asked." He loved her for that particular quality. The ability to show up without showing up, to be present without demanding the performance of gratitude. He went inside. He stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at things that had stayed the same. The coffee maker, the dish rack, the calendar on the wall still turned to the month he'd deployed, and then he went downstairs. The basement had been his father's workshop, 2-car garage converted in 1994, still smelling of pine resin and machine oil, and the faint ghost of a wood-burning fireplace his father had used during the winters when Oregon went cold and stayed cold, and the rain turned to ice on the back deck. His father had made furniture, not as a business, just as the thing he did instead of watching television or drinking too much. Chairs, tables, a pair of bookshelves that still stood in the living room upstairs, a crib that Danner's sister had used for all 3 of her kids. The tools were still there, hanging on pegboard, outlined in black marker, the way his father had always insisted they be hung. So you could see at a glance what was missing. Danner sat at the workbench for an hour, that first night, without touching anything. He just looked at the tools. He looked at the outlines. The room was exactly as his father had left it before the stroke in 2027. Everything in its place. Everything exactly where it had been described by the black marker outlines. Every tool present and accounted for. He was trying to figure out what was missing. Not from the shop. The shop was complete in its way, a room that had stopped in time. What was missing was the thing he could feel the outline of. In himself, the negative space where something had been, and had been taken, and it was not only the arm. The arm was the least of it, in a way that he would have struggled to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. He sat in his father's chair at his father's bench, surrounded by the smell of his father's work, and tried to find the edges of what was gone. The Vethrans had come in the way of things that do not announce themselves until it is too late to prepare. Like a cancer on a scan, like a fault line, like weather, moving faster than the models predicted. The first confirmed contact was a derelict probe recovered from a crater in the Mongolian steppe in the summer of 2029, a fragment of alloy with a crystalline microstructure that no known metallurgical process could explain, found by a shepherd's dog, and then by a geologist, and then by the Mongolian state security apparatus, and then, with the inevitability of significant discoveries, by the international community. There were 6 months of quiet analysis and quieter alarm before anyone used the word. The second contact was a signal, 3 months after the probe, that the SETI arrays in New Mexico picked up on a Tuesday morning, a repeating prime sequence transmission from a source, approximately 4 light hours distant, which placed it somewhere inside the orbit of Jupiter, and moving fast. The signal was elegant, mathematical, and completely unambiguous in its artificial origin. There were 36 hours of near-hysterical excitement in the scientific community before the signal's encoded secondary layer was decoded, and the decoded content was not a greeting. It was a survey. It was the functional equivalent of a resource assessment for a region under consideration for extraction. The third contact was a city. Harbin, in northeast China, took the first strike. Then Novosibirsk. Then everything seemed to happen at once in that way that catastrophes do, not in sequence but in layers. Events stacking on top of each other too quickly for causality to keep up. By the time the UN Security Council issued its emergency declaration, 3 cities were burning, and the Vethran advance ships had assumed low orbit over every major landmass simultaneously. The military response was improvised and partially effective. Human weapons worked on Vethran materials, with varying efficiency, a fact that the first week of engagement established with considerable collateral cost. The Vethrans were not invulnerable. They were simply not expecting resistance, at first, and then they recalibrated, and by the time human command structures had organized anything approaching a coherent defensive doctrine, the Vethrans had already extracted from 4 continental sites and moved inland. They were not, as the more hopeful analysts had suggested in those first terrifying weeks, a species that communicated through mathematics and wished to share knowledge. They were something older and colder than that. They had, as far as anyone could determine through the analysis of their tactical behavior and the physical evidence of their extraction sites, been crossing the galaxy for a very long time, not exploring, not fleeing, but harvesting, moving from system to system with the unhurried certainty of a tide, taking what they needed: raw minerals, atmospheric compounds, biological material, and departing. Earth had significant deposits of several rare earth compounds that the Vethran extraction process valued, and Earth had a remarkably oxygenated atmosphere that apparently had secondary processing applications. And Earth had, of course, biology that the Vethrans found worth cataloging in ways that the medical examinations of recovered soldiers made very clinical and very disturbing. They did not hate humanity. That was the thing that Danner had found in his bones, the hardest to accept. The Vethrans had not come to Earth because they hated human beings, because they feared them, because they perceived any particular threat or opportunity in the species. They had come because Earth was convenient. Humanity's suffering to them was the suffering of ants displaced by construction, noted in the abstract, irrelevant to the project plan. The war had lasted 16 months. It was not one so much as survived. The Vethrans had, for reasons that took the scientific community another year to understand, withdrawn before completing their extraction sequence. The leading theory, confirmed eventually by analyses of the radio frequency patterns of their departure communications, laboriously decoded by a team at MIT, working on the assumption that species practical enough to travel between stars would use practical mathematics to communicate, was that the resistance had made continued operations less cost-efficient than simply moving on. Specifically, the second-wave insurgency operations in the Pacific Corridor, the Appalachian tunneling networks, the distributed manufacturing infrastructure that human military planners had repurposed for rapid weapons production, and the emergence of what the Vethrans' own communications apparently termed the adaptive countermeasure phenomenon. The speed with which human forces developed, deployed, and modified weapon systems in response to Vethran tactical changes had together moved the extraction calculus from profitable to marginal. They were a practical species. They had done the math. Humanity was more trouble than it was currently worth for the specific materials in question when compared to the available alternatives in the outer system. They'd be back for the other things later. No one who had been in the war took much comfort in this. No one who had been on the ridge took any comfort at all. He started small. He had to. The first thing Danner made in his father's workshop was not a prosthetic limb. It was a wooden spoon. He found a piece of scrap cherry wood in the corner bin about the thickness of 2 fingers, and he clamped it to the bench, and he began to shape it with the spoke shave, one-handed, with the piece braced against a stop block he'd fashioned from a bar clamp. It took 4 hours, and it came out wrong. The bulb was too shallow, and the handle was slightly twisted. He put it on the bench and looked at it for a while. It was the first thing he'd made in 14 months, and it was bad, and he felt something about that he didn't quite have the word for. More like orientation, like finding north. He made another one. The bowl depth was better, but the handle was thick and graceless. Then another. He was beginning to feel the grain now, to trust his hands to correct without his mind, having to direct every adjustment. Then another, and by the 4th spoon the twist was gone. By the end of the week he had 7 wooden spoons of varying quality, and on the 7th he got the bowl depth right, and the handle came out with a gentle curve that fit naturally in the palm, that you would pick up and hold and find that it had been made with the hand in mind. He gave it to his sister when she came by on Sunday. She cried, which he hadn't expected. He hadn't thought he was giving her something to cry about. He just wanted the spoon out of the workshop. He'd made the things, and the making was what mattered, and the object itself was secondary. The spoon was evidence that the making had happened, not the point of it. But she held it and cried, and said it was beautiful, and he supposed it was beautiful, and he understood then that the making was not only for him, that things made with care carry that care into the world with them, that the curve of the handle communicated something it had no words for, and that this might be part of why people made things. The woodworking came back in layers, the way fluency in a language comes back when you return to the country after years away. The first layer was muscle memory, the grip of a chisel, the angle of a plane, the particular resistance of wood to a sharp tool moving with the grain versus against it. The second layer was judgment, how wood moves, where it wants to split, where the grain is trustworthy, and where it hides weaknesses beneath a surface that looks fine, the way terrain can look fine from above until it comes apart from below. The third layer was the most important and the hardest to recover. Patience, the willingness to work slowly, the trust that slow work done well arrives somewhere worth arriving. He'd lost a lot of patience on the ridge. Patience is the first casualty of the kind of sustained operational urgency, where every decision is a matter of someone dying or not dying, where slowness is a form of failure, where the nervous system has been recalibrated over 16 months to operate at a frequency it was never designed to maintain. Coming down from that frequency is not a single event. It is a long, slow descent, and it happens in workshops, in kitchens, in the specific quiet that exists only when no one is being asked to be ready. The workshop gave it back to him a little at a time. There was something in the smell of the place, the quality of the quiet, that was different from the quiet of hospitals and physical therapy, waiting rooms, and visa telehealth sessions, in rented rooms with institutional carpet. Those were silences full of things that hadn't been said. The workshop was a silence full of things being made. He started reading, not books. He'd always been a slow reader, easily distracted by the shape of sentences, prone to losing the thread of narrative, but manuals, schematics, technical papers. His occupational therapist had mentioned in passing the gap between commercial prosthetics and what was theoretically achievable with custom fabrication. She'd said it the way medical professionals sometimes say things they can't technically recommend, as information rather than advice. He'd found the paper she'd probably been thinking of through the kind of obsessive late-night internet searching. That is its own category of insomnia management. And then he'd found the citations in those papers. And then the citations in those citations. And by the third week of January, he had put out 40 pages of technical material and covered them in handwritten notes. He read about upper limb prosthetics, about myoelectric control systems, about targeted muscle reinnervation, about the gap between what was commercially available through the VA's standard procurement process and what was theoretically possible with off-the-shelf components, precision machining, and a person who was willing to learn. The gap was enormous. The gap made him angry in a productive way. The specific anger that comes from seeing something that should be fixed and being close enough to the tools to imagine fixing it. Not the helpless anger of the hospital waiting rooms. The useful anger of the workshop. The call from Wyatt Reyes came in February, 2 months after Danner got home. Wyatt was living in Bend now, 40 minutes south, in a rental house he shared with a guy from his old unit, named Coffee, who had come back from the war intact body, and was working through his own category of damage in the way that people do when the damage isn't on the outside. Quietly, slowly, with too much whiskey on Tuesday nights, and long silences on the weekends. Wyatt called on a Wednesday evening while Danner was in the workshop, and Danner almost didn't answer because he'd been in the middle of fitting a piece of aluminum bar stock into the lathe, and there is a particular concentrated stillness required for that operation that he resisted interrupting. But something made him answer. He'd think about that later. The way certain choices feel like gravity rather than decision, like the outcomes have been determined by forces operating below the level of conscious will. "I heard you were making stuff," Wyatt said. No preamble. Wyatt had never been a preamble kind of person. He was the type who started sentences in the middle, as though the context was self-evident, as though the conversation had been going on for a while, for already in the space where both parties knew each other well enough to skip the introduction. "Who told you that?" "Your sister. She showed me the spoon. I made the spoon for her. She shows it to everyone. She told my mom about it." "My mom cried." Danner said nothing for a moment. "I'm not making anything specific. She said you've been reading about prosthetics." "I read a lot of things." Danner. A pause. The kind of pause that Wyatt used when he was choosing his words, which was not often, because Wyatt usually said the first thing that came to him. This pause meant something was being decided. "I've been wearing this sock thing over a peg leg for 4 months. You understand that? A peg. I am wearing the medical technology of a 17th century pirate because the VA has a 14-month backlog, and my insurance won't cover anything they classify as performance grade." Danner said nothing. I'm not asking you for anything, Wyatt said. I wanted you to know I knew. Okay. There was a long pause on the line. The lathe was still. Outside the workshop windows, the February dark was complete, and the temperature had dropped enough that the moisture in the air was making sounds against the glass. I'm not promising anything, Danner said. I know, I'd need measurements, gate analysis. I don't have the equipment for that. I know a physical therapist in Bend. I don't have the materials for a first-rate socket fitting. And if the socket's wrong, nothing else matters. Everything about a prosthetic leg is the socket. You can machine a perfect mechanical knee, and it doesn't matter if the socket is off by 2 millimeters in the wrong place. I know. There was a long pause in which neither of them said anything, but the silence had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of two people not saying things. It was the silence of two people agreeing to something that neither of them was quite ready to name out loud. The particular compact that forms between people who have been in the same place and know what the other person is not, saying as well as they know what they are. Send me the therapist's number, Danner said. He heard Wyatt exhale. Just once, quietly. The kind of exhale that means more than it sounds like. The sound of something being released. The socket was the problem. The socket was always the problem. A prosthetic socket is, at its most basic, the cup-shaped interface between the residual limb and the mechanical device. The point of contact between flesh and function. Get it right, and the prosthetic becomes an extension of the body. Proprioceptive, responsive, something the nervous system eventually stops consciously managing. It becomes native, the way a well-worn glove becomes native, the way a good pair of boots becomes native after the break-in period. Get it wrong, and you have a device that torques and twists and creates pressure sores and phantom pain and the particular specific misery of a badly fitted shoe scaled up to the level of a load-bearing limb, but with the additional dimension that a badly fitted shoe you can take off, and a poorly fitted prosthetic you wear all day through a world that has not been designed to accommodate you, performing labor for a device that is simultaneously supposed to be helping you. Most off-the-shelf sockets were wrong in some degree for most people, because most people's residual limbs were not shaped like the industry average, and the industry average was itself a fairly crude approximation. Danner had found this in the technical literature and read it twice because the first time he'd thought he was misunderstanding it. The primary data set from which commercial socket geometry had been derived was predominantly white male, aged 30 to 55, lower limb amputation from vascular disease. The military amputee population from the veteran war was significantly different, younger, more diverse, different patterns of residual limb geometry based on the specific mechanics of veteran weapons versus the blast injuries and vascular amputations the dataset had been built on. The mismatch was structural, and no one in the commercial prosthetic supply chain had yet addressed it with anything approaching the urgency the situation required. Wyatt Reyes was 26 years old. He was not white. His amputation was traumatic, mid-shaft tibial, the result of a veteran acoustic weapon that had essentially disintegrated the bone structure while leaving the surrounding tissue largely intact, a pattern that the veterans' weapons created with what felt, to the medical community, like deliberate precision, efficient, specific. The veterans had in the last months of the war seemed to shift from lethal to incapacitating ordnance. No one had fully understood why. The leading hypothesis was resource efficiency. An incapacitated soldier required more logistical support from their side than a dead one, drew resources away from the war effort, occupied medical infrastructure. It was a tactic, and like most veteran tactics, it was coldly rational and effective. Danner drove to Bend in March with a measuring kit he'd assembled himself and a set of casting materials he'd ordered online, and a yellow legal pad covered in notes. He met Wyatt at the physical therapist's office, a small practice in a strip mall, next to a pizza restaurant that always smelled, whenever Danner passed it, of oregano and something underneath the oregano that might have been grief, if grief had a smell, which in his experience it did. The therapist was a woman named Dr. Lena Park, who had been treating amputee veterans since the first wave of the war, and who looked at Danner's homemade measuring kit with an expression that he would describe later as cautious professionalism. "You've done this before?" she asked. "No," he said. "You're planning to fabricate a custom socket, yes?" She looked at him for a moment. She had the quality of attention that Danner associated with people who had been doing hard work for a long time and who had learned to assess new information quickly because there wasn't time to be thorough and wrong. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you've read," he told her. He was thorough. He didn't simplify or summarize because simplifying and summarizing would have obscured the gaps in his knowledge, which he preferred to have visible so they could be addressed. She listened. She asked questions, specific, technical, occasionally challenging, in a way that felt like testing rather than hostility. The kind of questions asked by someone who already knows the answers and is checking whether you do. When he didn't know something, he said he didn't know, and she nodded, which was the right response, because it meant the acknowledgement of ignorance was being received as informations rather than disqualification. At the end of the conversation, she pulled a folder from her filing cabinet and put it on the desk between them. "I have 11 patients who are waiting for prosthetics," she said. "Their average wait time is 16 months. 3 of them are bilateral amputees. One of them is 22 years old." She paused. The pause was not for effect. It was because she was deciding how much of what she was actually thinking to put into words. "I'm not saying this to pressure you. I'm saying it so you understand the scale of what I'm looking at from my side of this desk." He looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "Start with Wyatt," he said. "Get that right first." She closed the folder. "Yes," she said. "Of course." The veterans had used a category of weapon that the military called a spindle, a directed energy device that operated on what was best understood as a resonance principle, matching the structural frequency of biological tissue or inorganic material, and then amplifying it until the target simply came apart. Against bone, it was efficient and silent. Against the armored hulls of human vehicles, it took longer and was less complete, which was why ground forces had been able to survive in protected positions, long past the point when conventional ordnance would have ended them. Against unprotected flesh at close range, it was instant. At longer ranges or grazing angles, the effect was partial, enough to destroy the structural integrity of bone without necessarily severing the surrounding tissue, leaving the affected area intact in form, but compromised in function, which was in many ways a more difficult outcome than clean amputation. The spindles had created a category of wound pattern that the medical community had no precedent for. The injuries were geometrically precise in a way that blast injuries were not, clean terminations, as though the body had been edited rather than damaged. Surgeons at Landstuhl and Walter Reed had described, in papers that circulated in the veterans community, the uncanny quality of operating on veteran weapon injuries. The tissue boundaries were too clean, the damage too circumscribed. The body looked less like it had been hurt and more like it had been revised. The psychological literature called this characteristic a significant complicating factor in body image recovery. Danner's right arm ended clean. The spinner had taken it at an angle that left the bone smooth, the surrounding tissue intact, as though someone had drawn a line and said, "Here and no further." In his first weeks at Walter Reed, he'd caught himself looking at the termination in the mirror, trying to find the logic in where the line had been drawn. There was no logic. The Vethrans hadn't chosen that point for any particular reason. He had been moving when the weapon fired. The line was where the line was. But the mind wants logic. The mind demands a reason for the line, because a line without reason is too frightening to accept as a permanent feature of the world, and so the mind goes looking for the reason, even when there isn't one, turning it over and over. The way a tongue returns to a missing tooth. He'd eventually stopped looking for a reason and started looking at his father's tools instead. Wyatt's socket took 3 iterations. The first was too tight at the distal end and created pressure points that Dr. Park identified in her post-fitting assessment 2 days after the initial fit. She called Danner with the specifics, and he listened and made notes and went back to the workshop. The second had a relief channel in the right place, but the suspension liner he'd chosen didn't interface correctly with the silicone sleeve, creating a vacuum problem that caused pistoning during the swing phase of gait, a vertical displacement of the residual limb within the socket during the forward swing that loaded the limb incorrectly and would, over time, cause secondary problems at the hip and lower back. The third one worked. He knew it. Worked, not from any measurement, though the measurements confirmed it. He knew it worked because of the way Wyatt walked across the parking lot to his truck when they finished the fitting on a cold Tuesday in April. Wyatt had been walking with a slight lean for 4 months, a compensation sin pattern that Dr. Park had flagged as a risk factor for secondary issues. The body doing what bodies do when they're in pain, redistributing load, creating workarounds that become their own problems. With the new socket, the lean disappeared. Not all the way and not immediately, but halfway across that parking lot, Wyatt stopped and stood still for a moment, and Danner watched him find his balance, recalibrate something deep in the proprioceptive system that the previous 4 months of bad fit had been miseducating, and then continue walking. He walked straight. He walked the way he'd walked on the ridge before the ridge became the ridge. Danner sat on the tailgate of his truck and watched him until he couldn't watch him anymore, because his vision had gone sideways in a way he hadn't been prepared for, a sort of overwhelming that came from the outside and had nothing to do with sadness and had no name that he knew. Wyatt came back and sat beside him. "Good," Danner said. His voice came out rough. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "Yeah, man, really good." They sat there for a while without talking, in the way that two people sit when something real has happened, and the words for it haven't arrived yet, and neither party is willing to fill the space with something that isn't equal to what just occurred. The pizza restaurant was closed for the afternoon, and the parking lot smelled of something sharp and cold from the mountains, and the sun was at an angle that made everything slightly golden, and it was enough. "Dr. Park's list," Danner said eventually. "The 11. Yeah." Wyatt was quiet for a beat. "You ready for that?" Danner thought about his father's workshop. He thought about the 7 wooden spoons. He thought about the way the third socket had come out, the feel of the finished piece in his hand before he'd driven it to bend, the knowledge that it was right even before anyone had put it on. He thought about the way the 6th try at a thing is always better than the first, and the 10th better than the 6th, and the 100th somewhere beyond what the first attempt could have imagined. "No," he said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." The workshop changed. It had to change, because what he was doing now was different from what he'd been doing in February, and the tools that had served one purpose needed supplementing for another. He added a small CNC mill he found second-hand through a machining forum, a unit that had been used in a dental prosthetics lab and still smelled faintly of the sterilization compound they'd used on it. He added a 3D printer, a decent prosumer unit, not industrial grade, but sufficient for the work he was planning in combination with the mill. He added a second workbench for electronics, because the myoelectric components he was starting to incorporate required a clean soldering station and better lighting than the fluorescent tube his father had installed in 1994. When the main concern had been seeing the grain of the wood, he put these things on credit cards. He was not entirely comfortable with this. He had a disability pension and some savings and an inheritance from his father that he had not touched in the 5 years since his father died. Had not touched it because he hadn't known what it was for yet, and now he did. He thought his father, a man who had spent his retirement making things for the people he loved, would have found this a reasonable use of the money. He thought his father would have been in the workshop on the weekends if he'd lived, asking questions, handing tools, making the particular comments that fathers make when they are proud and don't want to be obvious about it. People started coming to the workshop, not many at first. Wyatt brought coffee, and coffee brought a guy named Chunder from Portland, and Chend was a lower limb bilateral who'd been waiting for standard prosthetics for 11 months, and who arrived in a wheelchair with a laptop full of research he'd done on his own prosthetics situation. Exhaustive and specific, and covering several areas that Danner had not yet fully addressed in his own reading. Danner looked at the research and found it mostly good. He had to suppress something in his chest that wanted to feel competitive about it, which was both embarrassing and recognizable. The old reflex of the person who is used to knowing things, confronting the evidence that other people have also been working. And he suppressed it and said, "This section on the socket geometry is exactly what I've been working on. Can I keep this?" Chun looked at him for a moment, as if recalibrating. "Yeah," he said. "Of course." They worked together on the socket design. It was better for the collaboration. Dr. Park sent 3 of her patients, then 4 more. He was not running a clinic. He could not run a clinic. He had no medical license, no formal prosthetic certification, no insurance that covered clinical liability. What he was running was a workshop where a man who had taught himself through necessity made things for other people who needed them. Dr. Park was the clinical oversight. She did fittings, assessments, gait analysis. He made the devices. She told him when something was wrong. He fixed it. It was a division of labor that worked because they both understood their side of it clearly and respected the other's expertise. And neither of them needed to be the most important person in the room. It was not legal in any jurisdiction he was aware of. He'd looked into this because ignoring the legal reality of a situation was a category of foolishness he was not willing to practice. He'd talked to a veteran advocacy lawyer named Reyes, no relation to Wyatt, which was a coincidence that he noted, who had advised him that he was technically operating outside the scope of several regulations, and that the regulations in question existed for good reasons, and that the enforcement priority for those regulations in the current post-war environment was approximately 0. "Keep records," she'd said. "Document everything. If something goes wrong, you want to show that you were acting carefully and in good faith." He kept records. He documented everything. He had files on every device, every patient, every fitting assessment, every modification request, and the rationale behind it. Nothing went wrong. Or rather, things went wrong in the way that making things always goes wrong. A suspension component failed and required re-engineering. A knee joint mechanism he designed overestimated the user's gait speed and needed recalibration. A shoulder harness he'd fitted for a bilateral upper limb patient chafed at the anterior deltoid insertion and required a pad redesign. These were the normal failures of making. He fixed them. He learned from them. The next device was better. He had come to understand failure not as evidence of inadequacy but as information. The most reliable kind, the kind that costs something and is therefore accurate. Fern Oakcake arrived on a Tuesday in June. He'd heard she was coming from Dr. Park, who'd called 2 days before with a tone of voice that meant she was preparing him for something difficult, rather than simply coordinating logistics. "She's in a difficult place," Dr. Park said. "Psychologically. She's been through 2 fittings at 2 different facilities, and both were bad experiences. She's skeptical." "Okay," Danner said. "I mean very skeptical." She described the last prosthetist she saw as a, quote, condescending technician who had never fired a weapon in his life and expected her to perform gratitude. "Okay, I'm not telling you to be different than you are. I'm just flagging it." "I'll be what I am," Danner said. He thought about what he was. He thought about the fact that what he was included a prosthetic hook where his right hand used to be, which was relevant information in this context. Fern Oakcake had been a gunnery sergeant in the 10th Mountain Division, and she walked into the workshop the way she probably walked into everything, with a specific controlled quality of attention, taking stock of the space before committing to occupying it. She was a tall woman in her mid-30s, black, with close-cropped natural hair gone gray at the temples, in a pattern that Danner recognized as the signature of the kind of stress that doesn't care about your age. The accelerated graying that the VA psychiatrists had identified in their post-war cohort studies as a physiological marker of sustained high-intensity cortisol exposure. She wore thin compression gloves over her hands, and where the fingers should have been there were the commercially fitted prosthetic digits the VA had given her, functional, generic, and, by the set of her jaw, clearly wrong in some way she'd given up, trying to explain to the people who'd supplied them. She looked around the workshop. She looked at the tools on the pegboard. His father's tools, with their black marker outlines. She looked at the current project on the bench, a knee joint assembly he was in the middle of tensioning. She looked at his arm, the right one, and the work-grade prosthetic he wore in the shop. A heavy utilitarian unit with a terminal hook rather than a hand, better for grip and torque in workshop conditions than the cosmetic prosthetic he wore in public. More honest about what it was and what it was for. She didn't flinch at it, and she didn't make a point of not flinching. She just registered it and moved on, which was the correct response and the one he respected. "Dr. Park says you're the guy," she said. "I'm a guy," he said. Not modesty, precision. A small silence. "What do you need from me? Tell me what's wrong with the current ones. Which version of that answer do you want? The detailed one." She sat down on the stool he kept near the bench for clients, and she told him. It took 40 minutes. She was thorough and specific, and entirely unsentimental about it. The way people are, when they've stopped performing their own suffering for an audience that isn't paying attention anyway. He listened without interrupting. Occasionally he asked a question. About grip strength requirements for different task categories. About the trigger and reload sequence she'd trained on for most of her adult life, and whether she ever expected to return to that capacity. About fine motor tasks that mattered to her personally, and that the current prosthetics made difficult or impossible. She answered all the questions directly, and somewhere around minute 30, the set of her jaw changed, and something underneath it relaxed. Not much, not into anything you could call ease or comfort, but into the particular quality of attention. That means a person has decided they're being taken seriously, that someone is actually listening, that the information they're providing is being received and used rather than performed past. She had been a gunsmith before the military. She'd grown up in her uncle's shop in Cleveland, learning to disassemble and reassemble firearms by feel, in the dark, starting at age 8. This was not incidental to her identity. This was her first language, before the military, before the war, before the ridge and the acoustic weapon, and the precise removal of the second knuckle of every finger. Her hands were not just limbs she needed for daily function. Her hands were her professional identity, her technical language, the idiom in which she understood herself. He made her a set of fingers over 12 weeks. He made them 3 times. The first iteration was for fit, the geometry of the joint and the interface with her residual tissue. The second was for function, the tensioning and range of motion and load-bearing capacity under the specific demands she'd described. The third was for the details that made function feel like self, the balance, the tactile feedback properties of the surface material, the way the joints moved when she wasn't asking them to do any specific task, the ambient quality of simply having hands. The third set had a quality he was proud of without quite knowing how to describe. They were not indistinguishable from natural hands. He couldn't do that. No one could do that. And the attempt would have been dishonest in a way he didn't want the work to be. But they had a proportion and a texture and a quality of motion that looked, when she moved them, like they were doing what hands are supposed to do, not approximating, not compensating, functioning. The morning after the third fitting, she sat at his bench, and he put a disassembled 1911 pistol in front of her. He'd borrowed it from Wyatt, who collected them, who had 3 of them in various states of restoration, that he worked on in the evenings, the way other people worked on crossword puzzles. And he said without ceremony, Take it down and reassemble it. She looked at him. He looked at her. She picked up the slide and went to work. He watched her. She worked slowly at first, not because of the fingers, which were moving correctly, but because she was asking herself to trust something new, which is always slow. The nervous system is conservative about trust. It takes repetition and confirmation before it will commit. Then she found the thing. The proprioceptive calibration that said, yes, this is mine. This responds the way I expect it to respond. This is an extension of intent rather than an obstacle to it. And her hands moved the way they'd moved since she was 8 years old, and the whole operation took 4 minutes and 40 seconds. And when she put the reassembled pistol on the bench, she sat with her hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a long time. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be too small for the space it needed to fit into. Word traveled the way word travels in networks built on shared damage. Deliberately, specifically, person to person, through the channels of trust, rather than the channels of noise. Danner didn't advertise. He had no website. He had a phone number that Dr. Park gave to her patients, and that those patients gave to the people they trusted, which was not many people, because people who have been through what these people had been through had learned to be specific about trust. By fall, he had a waiting list. By winter, it was 18 months long, which was a number that sat in him like a stone. 18 months was how long it had taken the VA on average. He had not reduced the problem. He had created a parallel queue. He worked on this. He did not sleep enough. He knew this. Dr. Park mentioned it, with the frequency and the resigned certainty of someone who has accepted that she will not be listened to, but who intends to maintain the record regardless. He ate irregularly and worked late and woke at 3 a.m. to make notes on whatever current problem was occupying the subsurface of his mind. The geometry of a knee joint, the tensioning of a finger mechanism, the question of whether a particular suspension system was truly the right choice for a specific patient's gait, pattern. He recognized, with the clarity that comes from being too tired to maintain the comfortable fictions of self-assessment, that the work had become the thing that was keeping him present. Not here in the workshop, but here in the larger sense, oriented forward, anchored to time, connected to tomorrow by the things that still needed to be made. The ridge was still there at 3 a.m. The ridge was always there. But the bench was also there. And the problem on the bench was always more immediate than the problem on the ridge. And immediacy has a pull that even memory cannot fully resist. Alejandro Vasquez came in October, 2 weeks after the first frost. He was 21 now. He'd been 19 on the ridge, a private first class out of San Antonio, the youngest person in Danner's unit, a kid who had enlisted because his family had always enlisted, 2 uncles, a grandfather, a great-uncle, whose name was on a wall in Washington, and who had been, in Danner's assessment, from the months before the lip, fundamentally unsuited to war in the way that the best people often are. Too much imagination, too much capacity to occupy multiple perspectives simultaneously, not a liability in combat exactly. He was steady under fire, accurate, professional. More a liability in the afterward, in the quiet that comes when the firefight is over, and the mind, having done its job, has nothing left to be busy about, and starts processing what it witnessed. What had happened to Alejandro on the ridge was not a limb loss. He'd come away from the engagement physically intact, which was its own category of difficult. The particular guilt of the uninjured, the body's record of having been spared when others weren't, and the questions that accompany that record in the small hours of the morning. But the acoustic weapon had fired close, too close. Proximity detonation, meant for someone else. The field of effect catching him at its outer margin, and had done something to his nervous system that the medical literature categorized as sensorineural damage, and that the MRI images showed as subtle and diffuse and permanent. What it meant in practice was that his hands shook, not constantly, not in a way that anyone who didn't know would necessarily notice at a distance, but in the way that, for a person who had once been precise, who had, before the war, been the kind of person who could draw detailed mechanical diagrams in his spare time and build scale models and make small, intricate things with his hands. The tremor was a constant reminder of the distance between who he had been and who he was now, and what it had cost. He arrived at the workshop because Wyatt had sent him. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, which was something Danner had noticed other veterans do, assessing the space from the bus threshold before committing. He sat on the stool. He looked at the tools on the pegboard. He looked at the work on the bench. A partial elbow assembly, mid-construction, the actuator mechanism, visible in the partially closed housing. And something in his face changed when he looked at it. A quick, involuntary brightening that he immediately suppressed. The way people suppress things they've decided they're not allowed to feel. "What do you need?" Danner said. Alejandro said nothing for a moment. His hands, resting on his knees, were completely still in the way. Hands are still when a person is consciously holding them still. "Wyatt says you help people," he said. "I make things. I don't need a prosthetic. I know." Another silence. The heater cycled outside. The October wind moved through the pines at the back of the property. A sound that the Pacific Northwest does particularly well. Not violent, just present, a reminder of scale. "I used to make models," Alejandro said. "Scale models, aircraft mostly. I had a collection that I'd been building since I was 12, 60 or 70 pieces. I had them in my room at home, on shelves." He stopped, started again. "My mom kept them when I deployed. I haven't gone back to look at them." Danner waited. He'd learned to wait. He'd learned that people who were building towards something needed the silence to build in. "My hands shake now," Alejandro said. "It's not always, but when I try to do fine work, when I try to hold something small and make a precise movement, it starts." He looked at his hands. "I've tried 3 times since I got back. I bought new kits. I didn't want to work on the old ones. The model ends up. I can't finish them. I get to the detail work, and my hands shake, and I put it away." Danner looked at him. He thought about what he'd read, and he'd read about tremor, because it was in the VA literature, and because he'd made it his practice to read everything he could find that might be relevant to the people who came to him. Not only the current caseload, but the broader population and the full range of their experience. He thought about the adaptive tools he'd come across in occupational therapy resources for patients with essential tremor and Parkinson's, weighted instruments, dampening handles, modified grip geometries that reduce the propagation of involuntary movement from the wrist to the instrument tip. "I can make you a tool handle," he said. "A weighted grip with a dampening insert. Won't eliminate the tremor, but it'll give you a margin." Alejandro looked at him. "That's it? That's where I'd start. If it doesn't work well enough, we try something else. Add stabilization, change the weighting, look at different dampening materials. There's a lot of room to work in. You just do that." "I'd make it," Danner said. "That's what I do." Alejandro came back 3 times. The first handle was too heavy. The dampening effect was adequate, but the additional mass fatigued his grip over extended sessions, which defeated the purpose because the tremor worsened with fatigue. The second handle was better, but the balance was wrong, front heavy, which caused him to compensate with his wrist in a way that propagated rather than absorbed the tremor. The third was right. Danner turned it on the lathe from a piece of stabilized maple burl that he'd been holding in the materials cabinet for 6 months without knowing what it was for. The burl because the figure in it was beautiful, not because it was technically necessary, because some things should be beautiful for the person who uses them. Because beauty is not ornament. Beauty is the recognition that the object matters. He watched Alejandro use it at the bench one afternoon, working on the fuselage of a 1/48 scale B-17 that he'd brought in a box from a hobby shop in town. The tremor was there, still real, still a fact in the world that no amount of machining could make not true. But it had been pushed to the margin of the work. The weighted handle and the dampening insert gave him a fraction of a second more to correct it before the shake. propagated to the brush tip, and a fraction of a second was enough. It was enough to be precise. It was enough to finish. He watched Alejandro work, and he thought about the ridge. He thought about what the Vethrans had taken. Not just limbs, not just hearing and nerve function and undisturbed sleep, but the smaller things, the specific things, the personal capabilities that were not on any body chart and did not appear in any VA assessment rubric, because no one had thought to look for them. He thought about the gap between what the harvest had removed and what could be built back, and he knew that the gap was real and permanent. No workshop could undo the ridge. No device could restore the original. What the Vethrans had taken, they had taken with the finality of physics, but the gap could be worked. The margin could be found. A fraction of a second was enough. The government notice arrived in November. It came as a physical letter, which was how he knew it was serious before he opened it. Email was bureaucratic. Physical mail was procedural, and procedural meant someone had made a decision that required a paper trail. The letter was from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Regulatory Affairs. It informed him that his workshop activities potentially constituted the manufacture of Class II and Class III medical devices under 21 CFR Part 820, without proper FDA registration and quality system requirements, and that he was required to either cease operations or initiate the formal registration process within 60 days. He read it twice. He sat with it at the workbench for a while. There was a knee-joint assembly mid-construction in front of him, and he looked at the letter, and at the assembly, and at the letter again. Then he called the lawyer. "I expected this," she said. "Are you surprised?" "No," he said. "Should I be?" "No. You've been operating on borrowed time. The question is whether we fight it, comply, or negotiate a path to compliance that doesn't require shutting down." "I'm not shutting down." "I know. I wasn't offering it as an option." She paused. "Someone's been paying attention to what you're doing. Not just the FDA." "Senator's office," he said. He'd had a call 2 weeks prior from a staff member he'd been too busy to call back. 2 senators' offices, and a journalist from the Post called me last week. "I didn't talk to any journalist." "I know. One of your patients did." Another pause. "How many devices have you made?" 47, he said. "If you count the grip handles as devices, for how many of those has Dr. Park provided clinical oversight and outcome documentation?" "All of them." "And adverse outcomes?" "None," he said. "Some required modification and refitting. None resulted in harm. Dr. Park's records are complete." She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear her thinking in the way that lawyers think, not emotionally, but architecturally, building the structure of an argument, checking its load-bearing points. 47 patients with no adverse outcomes, full clinical oversight, in a population category where the standard wait time is 16 months. "Yes." "Okay," she said. "I think we're going to fight it." The hearing was in Portland, in a federal building that smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee, and the particular variety of stagnation that accumulates in spaces where important decisions are made slowly. And paperwork is the primary medium of consequence. It was a regulatory proceeding rather than a trial, which meant it was less dramatic and considerably more exhausting. Conducted through written submissions and testimony before a review panel over 3 days. Danner brought Dr. Park. He brought Wyatt and Fern and Alejandro. He brought a physical therapist from the VA in Seattle, who had written, without being asked, a letter of support that his lawyer called the single most effective piece of writing in the entire submission package, specific, evidenced, and clear about the human cost of the gap the workshop had been filling. He brought the records. Every fitting, every assessment, every modification, every outcome measure, organized in binders, with the same careful thoroughness he brought to the workshop floor. He did not bring a speech. He'd written one and then thrown it away. It sounded like justification, and he didn't want to justify himself. He wanted to show them the work. The panel chair was a woman in her 60s, career regulatory, who had the quality of sustained skepticism that comes from years of watching claims fail to match evidence. and who had, by the end of the second day, read every document he had submitted. She asked questions about quality control that were specific and correct. She asked about the cases where he'd had to redesign. Not the failures, she clarified, but the iterations, the moments where the first solution hadn't been good enough, and he'd found a better one. She seemed most interested in these. She seemed to understand that the willingness to iterate, to discard and rebuild, to hold the work to a standard rather than to a first attempt, was its own category of quality assurance. At the end of the third day, she looked at the panel and then at Danner and said, "Walk me through the O-cake fitting." He did. He was thorough. He described the first set and what was wrong with it, the second set and what was wrong with that, the third set and the decision to build for what the patient needed to function as herself rather than for what the standard device categories anticipated. He described the tensioning mechanism, the joint geometry, the material choices, the 12 weeks of work. He described putting the 1911 on the bench. The panel chair's expression didn't change much, but there was a moment when he described Fern's hands moving over the reassembled pistol, when something in it shifted. Not warmth, exactly, because she was a professional in a professional setting, and warmth was not on the agenda. Recognition, maybe, the acknowledgement of something done correctly. "Why the pistol?" she asked. "Because that's what she needed to do," he said. "Not for the military. She's out now. She builds competition rifles. Custom work. She needed to be able to do the work she was trained to do, the work she chose, the work that was hers, and she can. She sold a rifle last month," he said, "made entirely with those hands." The panel chair looked at the binders on the table for a moment. Then she looked at his arm. The hook, the same workshop unit he always wore, when he was going to be handling papers and equipment. And back up at him. She looked at him the way people sometimes look at him, with a particular quality of attention. That means they're putting something together, connecting the device on the end of his arm to the devices on the bench, to the choice to be in this room. "Do you have any intention of stopping?" she asked. "No." She nodded once, as though confirming something she'd already known. 60-day compliance suspension, she said to the panel. "We'll look at the expedited pathway." The expedited pathway took 8 months. They were hard months, not because of the bureaucracy, which was, as advertised, expensive and time-consuming, and occasionally Kafkaesque in its requirements, but because he'd had to slow the workshop, take fewer new patients, redirect resources from fabrication to documentation and process compliance. The waiting list lengthened, while he was building the institutional structure that would allow it to shorten again. He held this tension badly. He worked on holding it better. Wyatt was in the workshop on most evenings during those months. He started helping, initially with tasks that didn't require prosthetics knowledge, then watching, then asking questions. Then, one evening his hands found their way to the bench in the way that hands find their way to things that are theirs. And by the 4th month, he was doing basic socket fabrication under supervision. And by the 6th month, he was doing gait assessments with Dr. Park. That, she said, were some of the best she'd seen from a non-certified practitioner. "You should get your certification," Danner told him one evening. "I looked into it. 18-month program. We'd fund it." Wyatt looked at him. "You're building a clinic." "I'm building a workshop," Danner said. "But yeah." Chun drove up from Portland twice a month and spent weekends at the bench. Fern came in on Tuesdays. She had, with characteristic efficiency, taught herself the socket fabrication workflow without being asked and was doing it faster than Danner had been, after 3 months. When he pointed this out, she said, without looking up from the bench, that the fundamental logic was not entirely dissimilar from stock fitting, which was about the geometry of interface between an object and the body that would use it. "You should think about teaching this," she said one Tuesday. "I know. I'm not suggesting. I'm pointing out that the waiting list is 12 months, and there are other cities with the same problem, and 4 people knowing how to do this is not enough." "I know," he said again. She looked at him. You don't like the idea. I built this workshop because I needed the workshop. I didn't build it to scale. Most important things don't get built to scale, Fern said. They just turn out to need to be. He thought about this for a long time afterward, in the way that statements that are true settle differently than statements that are merely accurate. The certification came through on a Thursday in July. He was in the middle of fitting door joint assembly when his lawyer called. He put the phone down on the bench and looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to the fitting. He finished the fitting, got the shoulder moving through its range of motion correctly, documented it. Then he called Dr. Park. "We're legal," he said. She said, "I know." And then, "Congratulations, Danner." And then nothing else for a moment, and he heard in her silence the same thing he felt. Not triumph, because this had never been about winning, but the particular quiet of a door opening. "I need to expand," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting for you to say that." The new space was a former auto body shop, 6 blocks from Dr. Park's clinic. He rented it in August and spent September and October converting it with Wyatt and Tanjern, and a general contractor named Jim who was Fern's cousin, and who did the build-out at cost, and refused to be talked into accepting more, which Danner accepted because refusing was itself a kind of gift, the refusal to accept payment being the payment. The space had good natural light from skylights, concrete floor, enough room for 4 fabrication stations, and a fitting area, and a separate space for electronics and materials storage. He moved the CNC mill and the printers and the lathe. He left his father's tools. He thought about this for a moment, the choice to leave them. Then he went back and took them off the pegboard, put them in his truck, and drove them back to the house. He hung them in the original workshop, where they had always been, outlines intact. They belonged there. The shop on the hill was his father's place, and it was his place too, the place where he had sat for an hour without touching anything and figured out the shape of what was missing. The clinic was its own thing. The clinic was what came after. He hired Wyatt formally in October. He had 3 apprentices, 2 in prosthetics certification programs, 1 in engineering. The waiting list in December of that second year was 9 months long. He held that number. He held the fact that it was still too long, and the fact that it was shorter than it had been. And he worked with both of those facts simultaneously. On the 2nd anniversary of the end of the war, there was a ceremony in Washington. Danner watched 30 seconds of it on his phone while waiting for the lathe to finish a component and then put the phone down. Wyatt came in the next morning and was quiet for a while. "How do you feel about the whole memorial thing?" he said eventually. "I don't have a strong feeling about ceremonies." "I do," Wyatt said. "I feel like the ceremony is for people who are done with it, and I'm not done with it. Every time I do a socket fitting, I'm on the ridge. Not I'm here, I'm doing the work, but I'm also there." "Yeah," Danner said. Does that go away? Danner thought about his father's workshop. He thought about sitting at the bench the first night, not touching anything. He thought about the 7 spoons, and the one that came out right, and the 12 weeks on Fern's fingers, and the 3 socket iterations for Wyatt, and the 3 grip handles for Alejandro, and the 47th device, and the 57th, and the 81st, and the way each one was built on the ones that came before it, in ways he couldn't always articulate, but could feel in the work. "I don't think it goes away," he said. "I think it stops being the only thing." Wyatt nodded. He sat with that for a moment. "That's enough," he said. "Yeah," Danner said. "That's enough." Alejandro came by in the spring with a box under his arm. He was working now, drafting for an architecture firm that had recruited specifically from the veteran community, doing the detailed work, the precision work, the documentation of structures that needed to be made exactly right, because people were going to live inside them. He put the box on the bench. Inside, in careful layers of tissue paper, was a completed 1/48 scale B-17. Every panel line, every gun turret, every crew position, painted tiny and specific, with a precision that made Danner hold it to the light and look at it for a long time without saying anything. "You finished it," he said. "Third try," Alejandro said. First two I gave up too early. I was afraid of the mistakes. He paused. The third time I just kept going. Made the mistakes and fixed them. Danner looked at the model. He looked at the tiny painted crewmen in their positions, doing their jobs. You should keep it, he said. I made it for you. Alejandro said. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost. I wanted to give you something back. Danner put it on the shelf above the electronics bench, next to a small framed photograph of his father in the original workshop, holding a finished chair, squinting against the afternoon light. Coming through the window, it looked right there. It looked like it had always been there. Thank you, he said. The Vithransons had not gone. They'd moved on. Their extraction ships had folded out of the solar system's gravity, well on a Tuesday in March, and the atmospheric processors had gone quiet, and the smoke over the Cascades had finally dissipated. But the observatories were still tracking their transit corridor, moving through the Orion Arm at a velocity and heading that meant they'd be back. Not soon, not within a human lifetime, probably. But the math was the math. He thought about this sometimes. He thought about what it meant to build things knowing that the thing you were building against was not finished with you. He thought about the second wave, the third wave, the long trajectory of a species that had been doing this longer than humanity, had had language. He thought about what it meant to be, in the Vithrans's calculations, a harvest that had been deferred. Then he thought about his father's tools. He thought about the outlines on the pegboard. What was missing could be named. What was missing could be built. In the spring of the third year, the clinic saw its 200th patient. Dr. Park brought a cake. They ate it standing around the fabrication bench because there was nowhere to sit that wasn't occupied by a project in progress or a materials case. Fern made a toast. She held up a coffee cup and said, very simply, to the work. They drank to the work. Alejandro's B-17 was on the shelf overhead. Outside, the Oregon Spring was doing what Oregon Springs do. Half rain and half possibility. Neither one fully winning. Both present simultaneously, which was its own kind of honesty about the world. The waiting list was 9 months. Too long, he knew this. He held it. But it had been 16 months, then 12, and the direction of travel mattered, because direction is the only thing you can be certain about when the destination is still far enough away to be obscured. He went back to the bench. There was a shoulder assembly to tension, and a socket to inspect, and a wrist modification to design for a ceramicist who needed rotation and resistance that the standard terminal device didn't provide. He liked problems that required careful thought. He liked the fact that every person who came to him came with a specific and unrepeated set of requirements, that the work was never generic, that each device was a conversation between what could be made and what was needed. He picked up the shoulder assembly and ran the range of motion. Outside, rain crossed the skylight. The light changed and came back. He adjusted the tensioning 1 notch and ran the range again. Better. He noted the adjustment in the file. He moved to the next task. The ridge was still there. The ridge was always there. But the bench was also there, and the tools, and the outlines on the pegboard of the things that were missing, and the things being built to fill them. Both things were true at once. He'd learned to hold both. He held both. He worked. The rain moved on. The light came through. The work continued, patient and specific and alive with the particular kind of hope that is not optimism, not the belief that everything will be fine, not the declaration that the harvest failed and humanity triumphed, and the story is over. Something older and more reliable than that, the knowledge that things can be made, that skill compounds, that what is given back, even imperfectly, even in iteration, is worth giving, that you take what was taken and you build toward what it was, one fitting at a time, one socket, one joint, one weighted grip, turned from maple burl on a lathe in a basement that smells of your father's work. One limb at a time. That was the work. He did the work.